At dawn on Friday the 13th of October 1307, royal soldiers moved through the streets of Paris carrying sealed orders that had been prepared in secret for weeks. Every commandery, every Templar house, every knight, sergeant, and chaplain of the Order of the Temple across the Kingdom of France was to be seized at the same hour, before word could spread and before a single sword could be raised in defense. King Philip V, buried in debt to the very order he was about to destroy, had spent months planning this single coordinated strike, sending sealed instructions to his bailiffs weeks in advance with orders not to open them until the appointed night. Grandmaster Jacques de Molay was arrested in Paris that morning, along with more than 600 knights, dragged from their beds before sunrise, while their fortresses were searched room by room for gold that was never found. Within days, torture chambers across France were extracting confessions of heresy, idolatry, and blasphemy from men who had spent their lives defending pilgrims on the roads to Jerusalem, confessions signed under agony that many knights would later retract at the cost of their lives. Within 7 years, the order that had stood for nearly 2 centuries as the most feared military force in Christendom would be formally dissolved by the Pope. Its last Grand Master burned alive on an island in the Seine, while a crowd watched in silence. But here is what the history books rarely tell you. The Templars did not vanish. Their bloodlines scattered across Europe, hidden inside ordinary surnames that still exist today, carried by descendants who have no idea their family name once belonged to a warrior monk who knelt before the King of Jerusalem, negotiated with sultans, or died on a crusading battlefield with a red cross stitched over his heart. Genealogists tracing Templar lineages through French, Norman, and Scottish records have identified 15 surnames tied directly to the men who led the order from its founding in 1119 to its destruction in 1314. If your family carries one of these names, you may be sitting on a bloodline that once answered to popes and kings and no one else. Stay until the very end, because the final name on this list carries the deepest and most extraordinary royal connection of them all, a connection that modern DNA research has only begun to confirm. We begin with number 15, the surname Sonnac, and its later French and Anglo-American variants, including Saunier and Saunier. This name traces back to William de Sonnac, elected the 18th Grand Master of the Knights Templar in 1247, at a moment when the order was already stretched thin across a shrinking network of castles in the Holy Land. Sonnac inherited an order exhausted by decades of losing ground, yet he pledged the full strength of the temple to King Louis IX of France for the Seventh Crusade, one of the most ambitious and ultimately catastrophic campaigns of the entire crusading era. In 1250, the Crusader army pushed into the Nile Delta and seized the Egyptian city of Mansoura, only to be trapped and overwhelmed in the narrow streets by Mamluk forces who knew the city's alleyways far better than the invaders did. William de Sonnac was struck in the face during the fighting, losing an eye in the clash, and days later, as the crusade collapsed into full disaster around him, he died of his wounds inside the very fortress his knights had briefly held. His name traveled west with survivors of that campaign, through Gascony and into Louisiana with French colonial migration, where it survives today in Cajun family registers as Saunier and in anglicized branches across the American South, a name most bearers never connect to a one-eyed Grand Master who died in the mud of the Nile Delta. Number 14 is the surname Berard, sometimes rendered Berard or Bard in older French chronicles. This name belonged to Thomas Berard, the 20th Grand Master of the Temple, who took command in 1256 during one of the bleakest stretches in Crusader history, a period so unstable that rival Christian factions in the Holy Land were sometimes fighting each other as fiercely as they fought their Muslim neighbors. For 17 years, he held together an order whose territory in the Holy Land was shrinking by the year, writing desperate letters to Rome, negotiating truces with Mamluk sultans, and reinforcing the last standing Templar fortresses, while surrounding Crusader states fell one after another around him. He died in 1273, just 2 years before the fall of the Crusader stronghold at Tripoli. But under his patient and largely diplomatic leadership, the temple itself did not collapse when it easily could have. The Berard name moved through Provence and into Norman England, where it appears in medieval roles as Berard and Barrett, eventually crossing the Atlantic into Louisiana and New England family lines that today have no memory of the Grand Master who bought the order 17 extra years of survival through sheer diplomatic stubbornness. Number 13 is the surname Gaudin. This name belonged to Thibaut Gaudin, the 22nd Grand Master of the Templars, remembered for one of the most dramatic escapes in the order's entire history. In May of 1291, the city of Acre, the last major Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land, fell to the army of Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil after a siege that killed thousands and reduced the city's fortifications to rubble within weeks. As the walls were breached and Templar knights fought to the last man inside the order's fortress, refusing every offer of surrender, Thibaut Gaudin escaped by ship carrying the treasury of the temple, its sacred relics, and its most important records to the port of Sidon, and then onward to the island of Cyprus, sailing away from a city he knew was already lost. He died the following year, worn down by the strain of the evacuation, but the treasury and archive he saved gave the order a foundation to survive in exile for another 2 decades. The Godin surname originated in the Chartres region of France and followed Norman families into England, where it survives as Gaudin and, in some branches, simply as Golden, a name that carries almost no trace today of the man who carried the temple's gold out of a burning port under fire. Number 12 is the surname Rydefort, later anglicized as Ryford or Redford. This name belonged to Gerard de Rydefort, one of the most controversial and feared figures ever to lead the Templars, a man historians still argue about 7 centuries later. Elected Grand Master in 1184, Rydefort was known for a reckless pride that repeatedly overruled the more cautious voices around him. In July of 1187, he pushed King Guy of Lusignan into a disastrous forced march across the desert toward the horns of Hattin, dragging the Crusader army away from water sources in pursuit of a battle Rydefort was convinced he could win. The army, exhausted and dying of thirst, was annihilated by the forces of Saladin in a single catastrophic afternoon. Nearly every captured Templar knight was beheaded on Saladin's direct order that day, a mass execution meant to send a message to every Crusader kingdom in the region. Rydefort himself was spared, reportedly because Saladin hoped to use him for negotiation or ransom, and he continued fighting for 2 more years before dying at the siege of Acre in 1189, still leading Templar knights into combat despite the disaster he had caused 2 years earlier. The Rydefort name spread from Flanders into Normandy and appears in Anglo-Norman records as Ryford, Redfort, and eventually Redford, a surname whose bearers rarely know it once belonged to the Grandmaster blamed for losing Jerusalem. Number 11 is the surname Crayon, later spelled Crayon or de Crayon in Anglo-Norman and Irish records. This name belonged to Robert de Crayon, the second Grand Master of the Temple, who took over from founder Hugues de Payan in 1136, at a time when the order was still a tiny, poorly funded band of knights struggling for recognition. Robert achieved something no soldier before him had managed, and it changed the course of European history far more than any battle he ever fought. In 1139, he secured from Pope Innocent II a papal bull known as Omni Datum Optimum, which placed the Templars under the authority of the Pope alone, exempting them from taxation and from the jurisdiction of local bishops and kings across every kingdom in Christendom. This single document transformed the Templars from a small band of warrior monks into an independent, self-governing military and financial power that answered to no crown in Europe, free to build fortresses and move wealth across borders without interference from a single secular ruler. The Crayon bloodline spread through Anjou into Norman England, and with the Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland, where it survives as Crayon and Crean, carried today by families with no idea their ancestor once out-negotiated a pope on behalf of an army of monks. Number 10 is the surname de Bar, later anglicized as Bar, Bar, and Bar. This name belonged to Everard de Bar, the third Grand Master of the Temple, elected in 1147. Within months of taking command, he was riding alongside King Louis VII of France on the Second Crusade, a campaign that would nearly end in the death of the French king himself. In January of 1148, the French army was ambushed by Seljuk Turks in the mountain passes of Anatolia near Mount Cadmus, caught strung out along a narrow trail with no room to form a defensive line, and King Louis himself nearly died in the chaos, reportedly forced to fight for his own life with his back against a rock. Chronicles credit Everard des Barres and his Templar knights with reorganizing the shattered column in the darkness, protecting the king through the night, and guiding the terrified survivors safely to the city of Antioch days later. Louis wrote afterward that the Templars had saved both his crown and his life, and he leaned on Everard's financial expertise for years, effectively making the temple the royal treasury's first informal banker. The de Barres family went on to serve as royal counselors at the French court for generations, and the name survives today as Barres, Bar, and Barrett across France, Britain, and the Americas. Number 9 is the surname Torroja, sometimes rendered Torroja or Torroga in older Catalan records. This name belonged to Arnau de Torroja, elected the 9th Grand Master of the Templars in 1180. A vassal of the kings of Aragon, Torroja watched the Crusader states begin to fracture in the 1180s under the pressure of a newly unified Muslim world under Saladin, and made the unusual decision to travel west rather than remain in Palestine, carrying the temple's case directly to the courts of Aragon, France, and Rome in a last effort to rally a new crusade before the situation became irreversible. He died in Verona in 1184, still on that diplomatic mission, at the papal court of Pope Lucius III, never living to see the disaster at Hattin that would prove his warnings correct just 3 years later. The Torroja bloodline remained centered in Catalonia, spread with Aragonese expansion into Sicily and Sardinia, and later reached the Americas with Spanish and Catalan migration, carried by families who never learned their ancestor spent his final years trying and failing to prevent the loss of Jerusalem. Number 8 is the surname Saint-Omer, which crossed into English records as Samar, Summers, and eventually Summers. This name belonged to Godfrey de Saint-Omer, one of the original 9 founding knights who rode into Jerusalem in 1119 with almost nothing to their name and established what would become the Knights Templar. A Flemish nobleman from the county of Saint-Omer in Picardy, Godfrey knelt alongside founder Hugues de Payon before King Baldwin II of Jerusalem to swear the order's first vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, founding an institution that within 2 centuries would rival the treasuries of kings. Early Flemish charters record his brother William de Saint-Omer participating in some of the earliest land donations made to the fledgling order back in Europe, donations that would fund the order's first fortresses. The Saint-Omer bloodline crossed the English Channel with Norman nobility, and several genealogists trace the Summers and Summers families of Worcestershire and Kent back to this Flemish crusading ancestor, one of only 9 men on earth who could claim to have founded the Templars themselves. We are now past the halfway point, and the 7 names still to come carry the deepest ties to European royalty that Templar history has ever produced. If a name on this list matches your own, take a moment to note it, because what comes next connects these bloodlines directly to the crowns of France, England, and Scotland, and to secrets that Templar historians are still piecing together today. Number 7 is the surname Perigord, which softened over the centuries into Perry, Perigot, and Perigot in Anglo-American branches. This name belonged to Armand de Perigord, the 17th Grand Master of the Temple, elected in 1232 from one of the oldest noble houses in southwestern France, a family tied by marriage to the Counts of Toulouse and the Dukes of Aquitaine, giving him a pedigree few Grandmasters could match. In 1244, Perigord led the Templar contingent into the Battle of La Forbie in southern Palestine, one of the single bloodiest days in the order's entire history, in which more than 300 Templar knights were cut down in a single afternoon, a loss so severe the order struggled to recover its fighting strength for years afterward. Perigord himself was captured by Egyptian forces and never returned. Chronicles differ on whether he was executed shortly after capture or died, years later still a prisoner in Cairo, his final fate lost to history. The Perigord name survives in France and through later Anglo-American branches, as Perry and Perigot carried today by families who have no idea their ancestor commanded knights on one of the darkest days the order ever suffered. Number 6 is the surname Montaigu, which crossed into English records as Montague, Montague, and Montacute. This name belonged to Pierre de Montaigu, the 15th Grand Master of the Temple, who took command in 1219 at the height of the Fifth Crusades campaign in Egypt, a campaign built around the audacious plan of capturing Egypt itself to force the return of Jerusalem. Montaigu commanded the Templar forces at the brutal siege of Damietta on the Nile, a months-long ordeal of disease and starvation, fighting alongside King John of Brienne and the overconfident papal legate Pelagius. When the crusade ultimately collapsed in failure after a disastrous advance toward Cairo, Montaigu wrote a letter back to Europe describing the disaster in terms so stark and unflinching that it was later copied into papal archives as a warning to future crusade planners. The Montaigu family were vassals of the Counts of Poitou, and later the Dukes of Bourbon, seated among the great noble houses of Occitania, while their English cousins, the Montagus, rose to become barons and earls under the Plantagenet kings, a bloodline that quietly climbed the ranks of English nobility for centuries after the Crusades ended. Number 5 is the surname Blanchefort, which softened over generations into Blanchard and Blandford in English and later American lines. This name came from the Rennes-le-Château region of Occitania in southern France and belonged to Bertrand de Blanchefort, the 6th Grand Master of the Temple, elected in 1156 after the order had grown large and wealthy enough to badly need internal discipline. Blanchefort ruled the order for 13 years and is credited by historians with rebuilding its internal structure almost from the ground up, writing new statutes, formalizing the ranks of knight, sergeant, and chaplain, and negotiating directly with both sultans and popes on terms of near equality. Under his leadership, the Templars became the disciplined, centralized institution that Western monarchs came to both admire and quietly fear, an organization with its own courts and treasury, answerable to almost no outside authority. The Blanchefort family held the fortress of Château de Blanchefort near Rennes-le-Château, a site later associated in popular legend with hidden Templar treasure and centuries of local myth, and the Blanchard bloodline spread through Norman England and later into Louisiana and Quebec, carried by families with no idea their name is tied to one of the most enduring Templar legends in France. Number 4 is the surname Beaujeu, with cousin branches surviving as Beauchamp and Beauchamp in Anglo-Norman genealogies. This name belonged to Guillaume de Beaujeu, the 21st Grand Master of the Temple, born into one of the oldest noble houses in central France, cousins by marriage to the Capetian royal family and to the Counts of Savoy, making him one of the best-connected men ever to lead the order. Elected Grand Master in 1273 as the personal choice of Pope Gregory X, Beaujeu was already a veteran of decades of crusading warfare and spent his final years trying, largely in vain, to warn European courts of the coming fall. On the 18th of May, 1291, he was struck under the raised arm, in the one gap left exposed by his armor, by a Mamluk arrow while leading the final Templar charge during the fall of Acre, and died of his wounds soon after, one of the last defenders standing as the city collapsed around him. The Beaujeu bloodline continued through the Dukes of Bourbon, seated at the marriage tables of the earliest kings of France, and the name survives today as Beaujeu, Beauchamp, and in some English branches, Beauchamp. Number 3 is the surname Sablé, which softened into Sable and Sable in Anglo-Norman records. This name belonged to Robert de Sablé, the 11th Grandmaster of the Temple, and it carried a bloodline tied directly to the English crown itself. Born into the noble house of Sablé in the county of Anjou, Robert was a personal vassal and close companion of King Richard the Lionheart, trusted enough to be given command at sea, one of the highest honors a medieval king could grant. When Richard sailed on the Third Crusade in 1190, Robert commanded a squadron of the royal fleet, and in 1191, on Richard's personal recommendation to the order, he was elected Grand Master of the Temple in the Holy Land, a rare case of an English king directly shaping the leadership of the Templars. He held the office only 2 years before his death, but in that short time, he negotiated the purchase of the island of Cyprus for the order, laying the foundation for what would become the Templars' final and most secure stronghold in the East, after the eventual fall of the mainland Crusader states. The Sablé bloodline continued through the Counts of Anjou, kin to the Plantagenet kings of England, and survives today as Sable and Sable, a quiet reminder of just how close the Templars once stood to the English throne. Number 2 is the surname Molay, carried by the man whose torture and execution ended the Knights Templar forever. Jacques de Molay, the 23rd and final Grandmaster of the Order, was born around 1243 in a village called Molay in the Franche-Comté region of eastern France, far from the noble courts that had produced many of his predecessors. He rose slowly through decades of crusading service and quiet administration to reach the highest seat in the Temple, a rise built on patience rather than pedigree. On the morning of Friday, the 13th of October, 1307, the very arrests that opened this story swept him and hundreds of his knights into French prisons on the order of King Philip IV, a monarch deeply in debt to the very institution he was destroying and eager to seize its wealth for the crown. Molay was imprisoned and interrogated for nearly 7 years, subjected to torture until he confessed to charges he would later publicly retract. On the 18th of March, 1314, he was burned alive on a slow fire on an island in the Seine in Paris, choosing, according to chroniclers, to die proclaiming his innocence rather than accept a lighter sentence built on a false confession. According to chronicles written in the years that followed, Molay cursed both King Philip and Pope Clement V from the flames, summoning them to answer before God within the year. And remarkably, both men were dead within 12 months, fueling centuries of legend about a Templar curse that has never fully faded from popular memory. The Molay bloodline is rare today, but survives in pockets of French Canada and scattered American families, carried by descendants of the man whose death effectively ended 2 centuries of Templar history. And that brings us to number 1, the surname Sinclair, recorded in the earliest Norman rolls as St. Clair. This is the name tied to the deepest royal bloodline on this entire list, and to a Templar connection that historians and genealogists have debated passionately for centuries. The Sinclair family originated in the village of Saint-Clair-sur-Elle in Normandy, a modest holding that would eventually produce one of the most storied noble families in Scottish history. In 1057, a knight remembered in Scottish chronicles as William the Seemly St. Clair escorted the exiled Anglo-Saxon Princess Margaret Atheling to the court of King Malcolm III of Scotland, a journey that would reshape the Sinclair family's fortunes forever. Margaret, granddaughter of the English king Edmund Ironside, married Malcolm and was later canonized as a saint of the Roman Catholic Church, becoming one of Scotland's most revered royal figures. William was rewarded with the barony of Rosslyn, just south of Edinburgh, tying the Sinclair bloodline by land and by marriage to the royal house of Scotland from that point forward, a connection the family would maintain for generations. 2 centuries later, the Sinclair Earls of Orkney and Caithness governed a semi-independent territory along Scotland's northern coast, minting their own coinage and answering to no one but the King of Scots directly, a level of autonomy almost unheard of for a noble family in medieval Europe. Popular tradition, though not universally accepted by historians, holds that when Philip IV's arrests swept through France in 1307 and 1314, fugitive Templar knights found shelter on Sinclair lands in Scotland, a country then under papal interdict and largely outside Rome's direct reach, making it one of the few places in Christendom where a hunted Templar could hope to disappear. In 1446, Sir William Sinclair, 3rd Earl of Orkney, began construction of the now famous Rosslyn Chapel, a building whose elaborate stonework has fascinated visitors for centuries, with carvings that some researchers connect to Templar symbolism, including pillars associated with the legendary Temple of Solomon and geometric patterns some claim encode hidden meaning. Modern genetic and genealogical studies, including research conducted at Trinity College Dublin, have traced Sinclair Y chromosome lineages back to Norman crusading ancestors of the 12th century, lending at least partial scientific weight to a family tradition that has persisted, largely unbroken, for nearly 700 years. 15 surnames, 23 Grandmasters, and one of the most extraordinary falls from power in medieval history. From the founding of the order in 1119 by 9 knights with almost nothing to their name, to a treasury and network of fortresses so vast it effectively invented modern European banking, to a single coordinated dawn raid in 1307 that brought the entire structure crashing down in a matter of years. The story of the Knights Templar is really the story of these men, their decisions on crusading battlefields, their negotiations with popes and sultans, and the bloodlines they left behind scattered across France, England, Scotland, and eventually the Americas. Whether every genealogical thread connecting a modern surname to a specific medieval Grandmaster can be proven with total certainty is something historians will likely debate for generations to come, since medieval record-keeping was inconsistent, and surnames themselves were still evolving during much of this period, shifting from generation to generation as spelling standardized only slowly across borders. But the historical figures themselves, their crusades, their battles, their fortunes, and their downfall are not in question, documented across French, papal, and Scottish archives that survive to this day. If your surname appeared anywhere on this list, from Sonnac to Sinclair, you are carrying a name that was once spoken in the same breath as popes, sultans, and kings, a name that helped shape 2 centuries of European history, whether its modern bearers realize it or not. Tell us in the comments which name on this list matched your own family. And if none of these 15 did, tell us what surname you were hoping to see, because the Templars left far more than 15 bloodlines behind, and the next name we uncover may be sitting closer to your family tree than you think.